Hey USA, it's just me, and as you know, I'm nobody, just an American, and this is Just an American Moment. This is the podcast where we ask the questions the mainstream media won't ask, and we provide the answers and solutions that the political class either can't or won't answer. So, welcome. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast. So, before jumping into the main subject for today, I want to touch on some non news stories that are making up the news, and some news stories that aren't stories, and some stories, for the most part, that have been ignored. These are all another reason that I wrote my book, because quite honestly, I've just gotten tired of the lack of news coverage and the lack of common sense questions to be asked. So let me talk about my first story for the week. This one really excited me. This came out, I think it was on Wednesday last week. And this was a story about the fact that Princess Diana, 26 years ago, was coerced into a very personal interview. And now it appears that her sons are outraged by it, particularly Prince William. I don't think I'm really going to talk about that. Actually, I'm kind of amazed that that's even a news story. I mean, what is with our self absorbed media that they think we all want to hear about the royal family? So let's move on. The next big story, January 6th. You know, I'll bet you any amount of money that if I ask most Americans what happened on January 6th, they wouldn't have a clue. The only people interested in January 6th are those politicians and the media who want to make hay out of something that was basically a bunch of whack jobs who went into the Capitol. Meanwhile, outside you had, I don't know how many, 100,000 people or more who were having a peaceful protest, but instead you got some whack jobs in costumes who went into the Capitol and made a lot of noise. I guarantee you, most Americans consider what takes place in Portland and in Chicago and Seattle and New York and LA to be far more serious than what took place at the Capitol. And in point of fact, the only person harmed in the Capitol was a female veteran who was murdered at point blank range by Capitol Police. So when they talk about having a commission, and is a commission like the Russian collusion thing that we wasted $40 million on? Well, when they talk about having a commission, I hope the first question that comes up in that commission is, why was a veteran shot at point blank range who was totally unarmed? That should be the most important thing for us to know, because if we can't go into our capital without being shot to protest, then I think we've got a real problem. Then the other issue, big on the news, of course, is the border. Well, actually, folks, it really wasn't that big this week. In fact, you could barely find stories, maybe with the exception of Fox or Newsmax, or one of those, that was really talking about the border. They're kind of ignoring it. They're kind of downplaying it. Does anybody know why? I certainly wonder why. I wonder why they were flying children at nighttime, Mexican and illegal immigrant children. Why were they taking these children and flying them to a bunch of internal locations within the United States to so-called guardians who are not their parents, and doing it under the cover of darkness? They pulled them out of the Biden camps and then shipped them around the country. And in most cases, didn't tell the local jurisdictions that they were doing it. I don't know if that concerns you, but it sure as heck concerns me. And what's going to happen with these children? And where are their parents? Oh, and the other thing regarding the border, which is really a kicker, is they show the videos on TV of U.S. Border Patrol helping illegal immigrants out of the Rio Grande onto the shoreline in this country. And they're being escorted by coyotes. Would somebody please tell me why? Why? No one arrested the coyotes? Tell me why. Do you mean our federal government has a problem with arresting the coyotes? Why would we enable these people? But, it's kind of a non story, so let's move on. The last thing I have a question about is isn't Israel our closest ally? The relationship between Israel and the United States, I thought, at least at one time in my life, was a bond that couldn't be broken. Uh, it was only several months ago that we were working on the Abraham Accords, which was a true effort to establish peace in the Middle East. And yet, now we see Israel under attack by terrorists. And we get really what I would call fundamentally an indifferent response from part of our government and an actual hostile response from another part of our government. So, what's going on? Are we really going to abandon our closest ally? You've got to wonder. Somebody asked me recently, they said, well, why is it that so many Jews in America aren't standing up for Israel, particularly in our Congress? Why are they very tepid when it comes to Israel? And they're citing somebody like Bernie Sanders as a case. Well, I certainly can't speak for all American Jews, but I can tell you this: the Bernies of the world, the Chuck Schumers of the world, the Debbie Wasserman Schultzes of the world. The reality is that their faith, their religion, is the left. Whatever religion they were raised has been subordinated to their ideology. And that's what we see happening there. But you got to wonder about that, and you got to think about that. But let's move on and really get into today's topic, which I'm kind of amazed because I was actually had written down the topic for this week, last week, beginning of last week, and it has to do with COVID. And it's been kind of interesting that just in the last 3 days, I've seen Tucker Carlson start bringing up issues about COVID. I've seen Mark Levin bring up issues about COVID. And even today, Glenn Beck on the radio was talking about COVID. And of course, it's really interesting because in my book, I have a whole chapter devoted to COVID. Now, what I'm going to talk about today as it relates to COVID is not what I've written in my book, but it's important for you to know. And I really wish you would get the book and read about it because I bring up things that you haven't heard anywhere as it relates to COVID. And I would say they're fairly factual. So, no, not fairly factual. They're factual. And here's the point, folks, just to lend to my credibility. I worked in Asia and mainland China for almost 38 years. I started working in the mainland itself in 1981. This is back when people were walking around in Mao jackets and there were slogans all over the place and very few Western tourists. And quite honestly, even if you were a tourist, you were under strict control. If you were a businessman, you were under very strict controls as to where you could go and what you could do. I continued working through the 80s and into the early 90s. In the early 90s, I was doing projects up in Shandong province, in the area of Yantai, where when you landed at the airport, there were still MiGs sitting on the runway. And they confiscated your passports, and it was a very structured environment. As we got later into the 90s, I was deeply involved with major projects and businesses in the Shanghai area and other parts of China. And as we moved into the 2000s, I took over as the CEO of a high-tech company. I lived in Hong Kong. I had 2,000 people working for me, both in Hong Kong and China, and I spent a considerable amount of time in the Dongguan area of China. After that, I moved on. I continued doing work in China and literally worked there through 2014, where I had an opportunity to deal with lots of government officials, and I think I suggested that in one of my prior podcasts. So my familiarity with China is pretty in depth, and particularly as it relates to pandemics, because I actually lived in Hong Kong and China during the SARS pandemic, and I got to see how the Chinese handled it, and how the Hong Kongese handled it, and how the rest of the world reacted to it. And in that regard, I want to talk about today's subject because it really concerns me relative to the questions that aren't being asked. So before anyone nixes me off Facebook, I'm telling you things that I witnessed with my eyes, things that I know because I live there. And most of the people who view this probably haven't. So one of the things that really puzzles me with COVID right up front, and it has from the very beginning, is you've got a country of over 1 billion people. Okay. And this country of 1 billion people, Chinese government only reported 4,636 deaths. Now compare that to the rest of the world. Doesn't it make you wonder just a little bit? How is that even possible? And what's really amazing is some of the stuff that's come on this. Now, Wuhan, where this originated, and everyone is offended by the Wuhan virus. I don't get it because Ebola came from an area called Ebola, and so on and so on. The Spanish flu came from Spain, but everyone's upset when you call it Wuhan. I've been to Wuhan. It's not a big deal. It originated in Wuhan. Well, anyhow, Wuhan's got about 11 million people in it. And Wuhan had the bulk of the deaths, upwards of about 3,000, plus or minus a few hundred, as it relates to all of China. And most of those occurred within the first few months of the pandemic. Now, what's also interesting about the pandemic is if you go back and you look at business articles like Business Insider and some other publishers, Times, some other publications that are out there, there was knowledge back in January of 2020 that all this was going on. But it got very, very little media in this country. Maybe that's because there was some ridiculous impeachment going on, but who knows? Anyhow, it got very, very little coverage, and there was very little reaction time. But the point is that the deaths that spiked in China all seemed to spike in the first 4 months of 2020. Now, if you read a publication like The Lancet, some of the WHO reports that came out as it relates to COVID-19, it's really kind of amazing because they said that the Chinese were able to control the virus because they're basically a totalitarian government, and they basically were like a crackdown and on the people, and they were restricted, and there was no movement and all this. What a bunch of crap. Anyone who knows China at all knows, first of all, from a living perspective, it's a natural petri dish. You have people living by the millions on top of each other. Some of the social habits of the mainland Chinese is not unusual. People use communal bowls to eat out of, serve themselves. They use chopsticks to do that. So a chance for contamination can be relatively high. That's not an expert opinion. That's just a reality of the situation. But the fact of the matter is that the culture itself, I shouldn't say the culture because I don't want to misrepresent the Chinese people who I happen to personally like. But some of the behavior patterns are things that could lend themselves, and the living density is something that could lend itself to people basically catching a viral disease very easy. The other thing is this whole thing about, oh, well, there was no freedom of movement. I'm sorry to tell you, folks, there is freedom of movement in China. There actually is. Oh, yeah, they can crack down to an extent, but you cannot limit or mitigate the number of people who move from one area to another. It happens all the time, and anyone who thinks that COVID was contained by the Chinese in Wuhan hasn't been paying attention. Now, I laugh because I picked up some stats I wanted to look at the numbers because I'm familiar with all these places and I've been to all these places. You know, they're looking at a place like Guangdong Province, which is huge, had 8 deaths from COVID. Shanghai had 7 deaths from COVID. Uh, Beijing had 9 deaths from COVID. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? The fact that the virus wasn't rampant there can only mean a couple of things. In fact, the fact that the virus wasn't rampant all over China can only mean a couple of things. And it's not that the Chinese government controlled it. It means A, they've lied, or maybe unlike this country, when someone died from cancer but they had COVID in their system, they called it cancer as opposed to COVID. We'll never know, and I'm not going to profess to know. But the fact is, either they misled us all on the numbers and the deaths were far higher than that, or the Chinese were prepared for COVID. Now, were they prepared with a vaccine? Were they prepared with therapeutics? Were they prepared in some other way? I don't know. But we're not asking. And this is really what the issue is. What's going on, and why isn't the media making inquiries? I mean, the whole thing doesn't make sense. Why didn't anyone in our government, in fact, say to China, well, if China was so good at mitigating the disease, wouldn't we be asking, well, gee, how are you doing that? What can we do in our country to make that happen? Because let me tell you something. Manufacturing continued to go on. After April of 2020, products were still being manufactured. Factories were running. So what were they doing that the rest of the world wasn't doing? Or what did they know that the rest of the world didn't know? Why wasn't our State Department more engaged? Why wasn't our media? Why didn't we question people on the ground? You know, it's funny. I had some people during SARS come to me and ask me lots of questions about SARS. You know, it's funny. When COVID broke out, no one ever approached me or anybody else I know who lived in Hong Kong at the time. How we dealt with it, what we would do, what actions could we take. We just never saw it. But now, we don't see it either. I would be talking to some of the people who ran companies over there during the whole COVID thing and say, what did you do that enabled you to continue in production while the rest of the world was shutting down? We're not getting answers, folks. And that's got to concern you. I mean, that's got to concern you a great deal, because there are a lot of international companies. We're not just talking about Chinese companies. There is, and I'm going to end on this. I'm not going to go really too deep into it. But I'm saying that there's a lot of unanswered questions out there. One of the things that came up that I read in an article was that, I think this was from Business Insider, but they were talking to urban planners about the challenges in shutting down cities with population the size of those in China, 10 million plus people. And one urban planner, I believe the last name was Chen, pointed out that they had thought about how to do city lockdowns, but they had never considered it for a pandemic. They were trying to figure out what they'd have to do if they ever had to shut their cities down for alleged climate change. And that raises a whole bunch of other questions that we don't have time to get into today. I will tell you this, and it does concern me. SARS infected 8,000 people in China back in the 2000s, early 2000s, and only 774 died. Still too many. But the fact is, that did not spread as virulently as COVID. And yet, in China, we only hear that they had 4,600 deaths. There's a lot of unanswered questions here, folks, and it's time we started getting some answers. With that, I want to say thanks very much. I ask you, get the book. The chapter on COVID alone will share information that might just surprise you, as well as all the other chapters in the book, and particularly one on the political class, which, going back to my earlier comment about January 6th, might be of interest. So thanks very much for watching. I appreciate it. Have a good one.